Learning is something that is essential to all of us. It helps develop our knowledge and understanding of the world. Without it, humans might not be able to adapt, evolve, and operate. As we continue to learn new things all the time, since society continues to change in different ways, with new standards and expectations being put in place. However, when it comes to learning, there are many different approaches one might take, such as positive and negative reinforcement or punishment. But the most basic and effective form of learning is the theory or concept of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a process where a behavioral response which previously resulted from a specific stimulus now occurs to another stimulus that has been paired repeatedly with the previous stimulus. In other words, classical conditioning is a theory of pairing two stimuli together. Stimuluses are something that can trigger an action or a behavior. Examples are wanting to play the guitar the moment you see one, coughing after you smell perfume, or remembering to feed your fish the moment you see it. The process usually goes through three phases: before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning, and usually goes like this. Before conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus results in an unconditioned response. Meanwhile, a neutral stimulus is introduced, which leads to a neutral or no response. During conditioning, the neutral stimulus is paired up with an unconditioned stimulus and still results in an unconditioned response. But now, the individual that is being tested will now associate the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. After conditioning, the neutral stimulus is now a conditioned stimulus, which will now result in a conditioned response. The best example of this theory came from the man whose experiment resulted with his theory, Ivan Pavlov. This popular experiment was known as Pavlov's bell. The experiment included a dog being exposed to classical conditioning. It starts off with the dog being introduced to food, an unconditioned stimulus, and resulting in the dog salivating, an unconditioned response. Meanwhile, the dog would be introduced to a bell ringing, the neutral stimulus, which would result in a neutral response. Then the dog would be introduced to the bell ringing and the food being presented at the same time, neutral stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus, which would still end up in the dog salivating, an unconditioned response. Afterwards, Pavlov rang the bell, a conditioned stimulus, without any food. This would result in the dog salivating despite no food, a conditioned response. An example of this that anyone can encounter in real life is an individual eating a specific food and becoming ill, which will result in the individual trying to avoid eating that specific food in the future. There are other ways that classical conditioning can be encountered, like through media marketing or medical treatments. According to the National Library of Medicine, psychologists seem to agree that classical conditioning can correlate to human health, emotions, motivations, and treatment towards psychological disorders, which is why I believe that this is a concept that something could be implemented towards common human knowledge, since further studies of this concept can help influence human behaviors. Thank you.